Gone 15 years, and still Eliza Marsh walked the fence line every morning before the sun cleared the ridge, running her palm along the top rail as though the wood might remember a man's hand better than her own memory could. The homestead near Willow Creek had shrunk and grown by turns since her father died, smaller in the seasons when the well ran low and the roof leaked, larger in the hours before dawn when she lay awake and the empty half of the house seemed to stretch for miles. 15 years she had kept the fence mended, the garden turned, the taxes paid with egg money, and the sale of preserves she carried to town in a wagon that groaned louder every spring. 15 years since the letter had come, folded twice and stamped with an official seal, telling her that Levi Doyle had died somewhere east, in a fight whose name she had made herself forget because remembering it opened the wound fresh every time. She had been 19 when he left, standing at this very fence with his hat in his hands and a promise on his lips. "Come back for me," she had told him, "and I will be here." She had not imagined it would take him 15 years to fail at keeping it. She had not imagined, either, how a woman could go on loving a dead man so steadily that the loving itself became a kind of work, no less faithful than the milking or the mending, done every day whether her heart wanted to or not. The women in town had stopped asking years back whether she meant to marry again, though there had been offers, a widower with a good herd and a store clerk with gentle manners, both turned away with a politeness that left no room for a second asking. She had not wanted a good herd or gentle manners. She had wanted the one promise she had already given kept, and folks had learned to let her be, some out of respect and some out of pity, though Eliza had long since stopped minding which was which. She sewed her own dresses, salted her own meat, and on the coldest nights told herself that a woman who kept faith with a memory was not the same as a woman who had nothing, though some winters it was a hard thing to believe. This morning the frost lay thin and silver on the grass, and Eliza's breath clouded in front of her as she counted the posts out of habit, the way another woman might count blessings or count sheep. She had reached the 11th post when she heard a wagon on the road, and her stomach dropped before her mind caught up, because she knew already by the particular unhurried creak of its wheels that it was Silas Pruitt come to press her again about the land. Pruitt owned half the county already and wanted the other half, and he had found, in some dusty ledger in the land office, a clause from her father's original claim that named no clear heir but a son who did not exist. Only a daughter who had held the place alone for 15 years by grit, and by grace, and by nothing the law seemed inclined to honor. He climbed down from his wagon smiling the smile of a man who believed himself patient. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, though she had never married and he knew it, "you cannot hold a claim with no man's name on it forever. I've given you kindness enough. Sign the papers by the week's end, or the circuit judge will do it for you, and you'll get a fair price instead of nothing at all." Eliza did not let her hands shake, though they wanted to. "This is my father's land," she said. "I have worked it since I was a girl. I will not sign it away to spare you the trouble of taking it honestly." Pruitt's smile thinned at the edges, and he told her, not unkindly, that honesty had little to do with the law, and that a woman alone against a deadline was not a position from which honesty could win. Then he drove away, and Eliza stood at the fence a long while after, her hand once more on the rail, and she thought, as she had not let herself think in years, that she could use, just once, someone standing beside her who would not be moved. Levi Doyle had not died at Chattahoochee Ridge, though for the better part of a year he had wished he had, lying in a field hospital with a fever that came and went like a tide and a wound in his side that the surgeons did not expect to close. He remembered little of the battle itself, only the noise of it, and then waking under canvas among men worse off than himself, and a chaplain writing down names for a casualty list in a hand too tired to be careful. His own name had gone on to that list by another man's mistake, a Doyle who had died beside him, and by the time Levi was well enough to correct the record, the letter had already gone out, already reached a homestead near Willow Creek, already broken a heart he had left whole. It took him 4 years to walk without the limp showing, and longer than that to pay off what he owed the surgeon who had kept him breathing, working a rancher's cattle in a county far from anywhere he knew, sending letters that he learned only much later. A jealous cousin of his had been paid to burn before they reached the post. He had believed wrongly that Eliza had married and moved on, that his return would only wound her twice. It was a foreman's careless remark years afterward, about a woman near Willow Creek still unmarried and still tending her father's fence alone, that had put the truth in front of him at last, plain and unbearable. He had ridden 3 states to reach her, and every mile of it he had rehearsed what he would say, and none of the words had come out right in his head even once. There had been nights in that far county, mending fence for wages that went straight to a debt not truly his own, when the only thing that had kept him upright was the memory of a girl at a rail near Willow Creek telling him she would be there. He had not let himself write false hope into that memory, had told himself 100 times to let her go and build a life unhaunted by a dead man's promise, and every time he had failed to make himself believe it, because some promises, he had learned, do not loosen their hold no matter how a man reasons with them. He crossed into familiar country on a morning gone gold with early light, and something in his chest tightened at the sight of the creek, at the shape of the ridge, at a fence line he had helped set posts for as a younger man with no notion yet of how long a road could turn out to be. He reined in his horse at the top of the rise and looked down at the homestead, smaller than he remembered and somehow, for that, more precious, and he saw a woman at the fence with a hand on the rail, and though 15 years had put silver at her temples and weather in her face, he knew her the way he knew his own name. Eliza heard the horse before she let herself look, told herself it was only Prout returned to press her further, and turned with the argument already rising in her throat. The words died there. A man sat a horse at the top of the rise, and though the years had broadened his shoulders and carved lines into a face she had once known smooth, she would have known him blind, would have known him by the particular way he sat still before he moved, the way he used to sit still before he kissed her. Her legs would not carry her at first. She stood with her hand locked on the fence rail as if the wood were the only thing keeping the earth steady beneath her. He came down the rise slow, the way a man approaches something he is afraid might be real, and dismounted a few yards off, and neither of them spoke for a long moment, because there did not seem to be a first word large enough for 15 years. It was Eliza who found her voice first, though it came out smaller than she meant it. "They told me you were dead," she said. "I buried you 100 times in my mind, and you never once stayed buried." Levy's throat worked before he answered. "I know it," he said. "I know what they told you, and I know what it cost you, and I have spent every year since trying to walk back to this fence, and I am sorrier than a man has words for that. It took me 15 of them." She wanted to be angry. She had practiced being angry, alone in the dark on nights when grief curdled into something sharper, imagining what she would say if he ever walked up that rise. But standing before him now, seeing the scar that pulled at his side when he moved, seeing the grey that had come early to his hair the way it had come early to hers, all the anger she'd rehearsed dissolved into something closer to disbelief, and beneath the disbelief, unbearably, hope. "Tell me," she said. "All of it. I have waited 15 years for the truth. I can bear hearing it plainly." So he told her, standing at the fence with his hat in his hands the way he had held it the day he left, about the battle and the wrong name on the casualty list, about the fever and the debt, and the cousin who had burned his letters out of an old jealousy over land that was never his to want. He told her about the foreman's careless remark that had cracked his world open again, and the 3 states he had crossed to reach her, and how every mile he had feared arriving to find her married, or gone, or simply unwilling to forgive a silence so long it had grown its own weight. "I would not have blamed you," he said. "I do not blame you now, whatever you decide, but I could not die a second time without you knowing it wasn't my choosing that kept me gone." Eliza looked at him a long while, at the man who had been a boy when he left her, at the 15 years written plainly in both their faces, and she found that the love she had kept alive through all of it had not dimmed so much as deepened, the way a well dug patiently goes down farther than one dug in haste, and holds more, and holds it longer. "I never stopped this fence," she said, her hand still on the rail. "I mended it every spring so there would be something whole for you to come back to, even after I told myself you never would." Levy crossed the last few feet between them then, and took her hand from the wood, gently, and held it the way a man holds something he has been afraid, for 15 years, that he would never be permitted to hold again, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, because there was nothing left that needed saying with words. A tear slid down her cheek before she could stop it, and Levy's thumb was there to catch it gentle, the way he might once have brushed dust from a saddle he cared for. "I am not the girl you left," she said quietly. 15 years have put lines on me too. Levy shook his head, slow and certain. "You are exactly the woman I hoped you'd become," he said. "And every line on your face is a year I am grateful you lived through, even the years I was not here to share them." It was Eliza who told him about Pruita. Over coffee gone cold in the kitchen that had been her mother's and then only hers, and Levy's jaw set in a way she remembered from before he'd ever had to be a soldier. A plain, stubborn refusal that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with what he meant to protect. "He does not know the land has a man standing on it now," Levy said. "He will know it by week's end." Eliza's hand found his across the table, and she said low that she had held this place alone for 15 years and would not have him thinking she needed rescuing from a fight she had already been fighting. "I know you don't need it," Levy told her, holding her hand tighter. "I am not offering to fight it for you. I am asking to stand beside you while you finish it, if you will let me." It was, she thought, exactly the right thing to say, and exactly what 15 years of loving a memory had never once let her hear aloud. Pruit did not wait for the week's end. He came 2 nights later after dark, with 3 hired men and a wagon meant to carry off whatever he judged could be sold before the law caught up to the wrongness of what he was doing, believing a woman alone would rather lose her belongings quiet than fight him loud. He had not reckoned on a man home from the dead standing on the porch with a rifled easy but ready, nor on the lantern light throwing Levy's shadow twice as large across the yard as he stood between Pruit's men and the door of the house Eliza's father had built with his own 2 hands. "You've no claim here tonight," Levy said, and his voice did not rise, which made it carry farther than shouting would have. "The judge hasn't ruled, the week isn't out, and you'll not lay a hand on this homestead while I'm standing on it." Pruit's foreman, a broad man named Cutter, took a step forward as if size alone might settle the matter, and Levy did not move an inch, only leveled a look at him that 15 years of surviving worse than a foreman's temper had taught him to give. "This land has stood 15 years on her strength alone," Levy said, "and I'll not watch it taken from her in one night by men too impatient to wait for a judge's honest word." Cutter glanced at Pruit for instruction and found none offered, and the hesitation in that glance told its own story. Behind him in the doorway, Eliza stood with a lantern of her own, unafraid to be seen standing her ground, and it was the sight of the 2 of them together, unmoved and unmatched, that seemed finally to cool Pruit's nerve. There is a difference, Pruit found, between bullying a woman alone and facing a man who has already walked through worse than a bad night at a fence line, and after a long, taut minute in which nothing but the horses shifted, he ordered his men back onto the wagon, muttering that the judge would hear of trespass and threat both. Though everyone standing in that yard understood whose trespass it truly was. When the sound of the wagon wheels had faded down the road, Levy let out a breath he had been holding, and Eliza came down off the porch and pressed her forehead to his chest. And for a moment neither of them said anything, only stood together in the lantern light with the homestead quiet and whole behind them. The circuit judge, when he came at week's end as promised, took one look at the clause in the old claim and one look at the 2 of them standing before him, and asked plainly whether there was a wedding to be had, because a husband's name on a license would settle Pruit's clause faster and cleaner than any argument of law. Eliza had half expected to bristle at being told marriage was the practical answer to a legal knot, but when she looked at Levy and saw the same thought already forming gentle in his eyes, unhurried, unafraid, offered rather than imposed, she understood that this was not the law choosing for her. It was only the law, for once, agreeing with her heart's own long-settled mind. They were married in the yard by the fence, with Willow Creek running behind them and half the county come to see a story they had all believed ended 15 years before turn out after all, only to have been delayed. Eliza wore her mother's blue dress, let out at the seams and pressed careful the night before, and Levy stood in a borrowed coat with his hat in his hands one final time, and when the preacher asked if she would have this man, she said yes in a voice that did not shake at all, because there was nothing left in her that doubted it. That evening, when the guests had gone and the lanterns had been carried in, Eliza walked the fence line one more time, out of habit more than need, and Levy walked beside her with her hand in his, and she found she no longer counted the posts as if counting could summon anything. There was nothing left to wish for that had not already arrived. 15 years, she said softly, more to the evening than to him. Levy's hand tightened around hers. 15 years too long, he said, and I mean to spend the rest of them making up every one I owe you. Eliza looked at the man beside her, weathered and steady and finally entirely present, and thought that some promises took longer to keep than others, but a promise kept late was still, in the end, a promise kept whole. She had waited at this fence for 15 years, and standing there now with his hand warm around hers, she understood she would have waited 15 more, if it meant this was the man who finally came walking home,